Every army enters a war carrying assumptions. Some are written into field manuals, others are so deeply embedded that no one thinks to question them. On Guadalcanal in early 1943, one of those assumptions was simple and absolute. Firepower wins fights. And anything that fires slower than the standard infantry rifle is a liability. Second Lieutenant John George knew that assumption well. He had been taught it. He had been examined on it. He had repeated it back to instructors who had never fired a shot in anger. And on the morning of January 22nd, crouched in shattered coral rock west of Point Cruz, he was about to violate it completely. George did not carry what the Army considered a proper combat rifle. Slung carefully across his chest was a Winchester Model 70, a bolt-action sporting rifle with a civilian pedigree. It wore a Lyman Alaskan scope, the kind sold through mail-order catalogs to hunters and competitive marksmen back home. The rifle had cost him 2 full years of National Guard pay. To his fellow officers, that alone was evidence of poor judgment. They called it a toy. They called it a sweetheart. One captain called it an accident waiting to happen and ordered George to leave it in his tent and draw a real weapon from the company racks. George did not argue. He simply nodded, waited, and carried it anyway. At the time, Japanese snipers had killed 14 American soldiers in 72 hours. They did not fire rapidly. They did not reveal themselves. They killed one man at a time, usually at dawn or dusk, and vanished into foliage so dense it seemed to swallow sound itself. Platoons froze. Patrols halted. Men began to move cautiously, not because of doctrine, but because fear had found its way into the ranks. The official response was predictable. Increase firepower. Push forward aggressively. Suppress likely sniper positions with volume. The solution, according to doctrine, was always more noise. What doctrine did not account for was terrain. Guadalcanal was not a battlefield that rewarded speed, a punished movement. Visibility collapsed into narrow lanes of fire measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Engagements were sudden, intimate, and unforgiving. A single shot, fired without warning, mattered more than an entire clip emptied too late. John George had learned something long before the war that the Army had not. He had learned that precision was not a luxury. It was a discipline. As a civilian, George had been a serious rifleman, not a hobbyist, not a casual hunter. He shot deliberately, methodically, and with an understanding that accuracy was not a function of luck, but of consistency, breath control, trigger discipline, knowing when not to fire. Those skills did not disappear simply because a uniform replaced a hunting jacket. On Guadalcanal, they became more valuable than ever. At first light on January 22nd, George positioned himself among the ruins of a former plantation structure, its walls blasted open by artillery weeks earlier. He did not scan wildly. He did not rush. He watched shadows. He watched leaves that did not move with the wind. He watched for absence rather than presence. Through his scope, he noticed something that every infantryman had been trained to ignore. A faint reflection, not a muzzle flash, not movement. Just the brief glint of glass catching light where no glass should have been. A Japanese sniper had made the same mistake that hunters sometimes make when they forget the sun. George did not fire immediately. He waited. He adjusted. He let the sniper settle. When he pressed the trigger, the Winchester bucked gently, and the sound was sharp but singular. No follow-up shots. No barrage. Just one. The glint vanished. Within minutes, the firing that had plagued the sector for days stopped entirely. That was the moment no report would fully capture. Not the kill itself, but the silence that followed. The sudden absence of threat where constant pressure had lived. Men noticed it instinctively. They lifted their heads. They moved again. Over the next 4 days, George repeated the process. He did not hunt aggressively. He waited. He allowed enemy snipers to reveal themselves through impatience or habit. His bolt-action rifle fired slower than an M1 Garand, but it grouped tighter at 300 yards than most service rifles did at half that distance. Each shot was deliberate. Each hit was final. By the end of the fourth day, Japanese sniper activity in the Point Cruz sector had effectively ceased. No doctrine explained that outcome. The Army had believed that a semi-automatic rifle, with its higher rate of fire and faster reloads, was inherently superior in all infantry engagements. That belief came from European assumptions, open terrain, and a focus on suppressive fire. Guadalcanal exposed the limits of that thinking. In dense jungle, where targets appeared briefly and unpredictably, accuracy mattered more than speed. Word spread quietly, not through official channels. Through observation, platoon leaders noticed which sectors were quiet. Battalion commanders noticed casualty rates drop. They noticed that when George was present, snipers stopped being a problem. No one apologized to him. No one formally endorsed his rifle, but no one ordered him to leave it behind again. What George had demonstrated was not that bolt-action rifles were superior weapons. He demonstrated something far more unsettling, that the Army had undervalued the individual rifleman. That training had prioritized volume over judgment. That in the rush to modernize, something old and effective had been nearly discarded. The Japanese understood this instinctively. Their snipers were not trained to fire rapidly. They were trained to wait, to observe, to strike once and disappear. George did not defeat them by matching their weapons. He defeated them by matching their patience. Years later, George would write that the war taught him how little most armies understood about marksmanship. At the time, he did not write anything. He simply kept shooting. And others began to imitate him. Not with Winchester Model 70s, not with mail-order scopes, but with a renewed attention to fundamentals. Officers began assigning the best shots to overwatch positions. They stopped mocking precision optics. They stopped assuming that more fire meant more control. None of this appeared in training circulars. None of it made headlines. God. But across the Pacific, small unit tactics quietly shifted. Sniper engagements became contests of discipline rather than volume. All because one lieutenant carried the wrong rifle into the right fight. And because Guadalcanal, indifferent to doctrine, rewarded the man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is not the fastest one, but the one that puts a single bullet exactly where it belongs. The United States Army did not neglect marksmanship by accident. It did so deliberately and for reasons that made sense on paper. Between the wars, American military planners looked at the next conflict and saw scale. They saw mass armies, rapid movement, and firepower measured not in individual shots but in sustained output. The individual rifleman, once the centerpiece of American military identity, was quietly redefined as one component in a larger system. Training reflected that shift. Recruits were taught to fire quickly, to engage multiple targets, to keep rounds moving downrange. Accuracy was important, but only to a point. Beyond that point, speed mattered more. The semi-automatic M1 Garand became the symbol of this philosophy. 8 rounds, rapid follow-up shots, a rifle that rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. The Army loved the Garand because it fit the doctrine perfectly. It was reliable. It was rugged. And in the hands of an average soldier, it produced more firepower than any bolt-action rifle ever could. In Europe, across open fields and long sight lines, that advantage often proved decisive. But doctrine has a weakness. It assumes the battlefield will cooperate. On Guadalcanal, the battlefield did not. Visibility was rarely more than a few dozen yards. The jungle compressed time and distance until engagements unfolded in seconds. Targets appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Suppression fire, so effective in open terrain, became meaningless when the enemy fired once and disappeared into vegetation that swallowed bullets without complaint. What mattered instead was the first shot. Yet the Army's training had quietly conditioned soldiers to devalue that moment. Recruits learned to fire strings, not single rounds. They learned to recover from recoil rather than eliminate it. They learned that missing the first shot was acceptable because there would always be a second, a third, a fourth. Japanese snipers exploited that assumption ruthlessly. Imperial Japanese Army sniper training emphasized patience above all else. Many of their marksmen came from rural backgrounds where hunting was common and ammunition scarce. They learned early that every shot mattered. In combat, they were taught not to fire unless success was nearly guaranteed. One shot, one casualty. Then silence. American soldiers found this unnerving. They were prepared for firefights, not executions. A sniper who fired only once disrupted rhythm, shattered confidence, and forced units to slow down. That slowdown, in turn, created more opportunities for ambush. The Army's answer was almost always the same. Push harder, more patrols, more fire. More movement, it rarely worked. John George recognized the disconnect immediately. Not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because his experience lived outside the Army's institutional habits. Civilian marksmanship did not reward volume. Punished waste. On a range or in the field, there was no suppressive fire. There was only the hit or the miss. The Winchester Model 70 embodied that philosophy. It did not forgive poor technique. Its bolt had to be worked manually. Its trigger broke cleanly and without warning. Every shot demanded preparation. For George, that was not a disadvantage. It was familiarity. The Army saw the rifle and saw limitation. George saw predictability. That difference mattered. At distances beyond 200 yards, the Garand's advantages diminished. Rapid fire mattered less when the target appeared briefly. The Garand's iron sights were excellent, but they required exposure. To aim precisely, a soldier often had to reveal more of himself than a scoped rifleman would. In jungle conditions, that exposure could be fatal. George's scope allowed him to observe without moving. To study terrain, not just targets. He could wait for mistakes rather than forcing engagements. That was not taught in infantry school. It was learned the hard way or not at all. As word of his effectiveness spread, something subtle changed. Other officers did not suddenly abandon their Garands. They did something quieter. They stopped dismissing the idea that one man, positioned correctly, could control a sector more effectively than a squad firing blindly. This ran counter to everything the Army wanted to believe about modern warfare. The institution preferred solutions that scaled. A better rifle for everyone. More ammunition. More training hours. What George demonstrated was not scalable in the same way. Precision required time, judgment, individual responsibility. Those qualities resisted standardization. And yet, the battlefield kept rewarding them. Japanese snipers began avoiding sectors where they suspected American precision shooters were present. They shifted routes. They delayed movement. That alone altered the tempo of operations. Control was no longer exerted through noise, but through uncertainty. This was not an official program. No memos circulated. No manuals were rewritten. But combat units learn quickly, and they learn honestly. Men who survived paid attention to why. In after-action reports, officers struggled to describe what was happening. They wrote about effective counter-sniper fire and improved overwatch. They did not mention civilian rifles. They did not mention scopes purchased through catalogs. Those details felt improper, almost embarrassing. But they noticed the results. The Army had entered the war believing that speed of fire equaled dominance. Guadalcanal suggested something else. That dominance came from control of space. And that space could be controlled by a single, disciplined rifleman who understood when to act and when not to. This realization unsettled commanders because it forced a reassessment of authority. Doctrine existed to remove uncertainty from decision-making. George introduced uncertainty back into the equation. He made judgment central again. Not everyone welcomed that. Some officers dismissed his success as luck. Others argued that Japanese snipers were poorly trained or poorly equipped. These explanations were comforting because they required no change. But they did not hold up. Japanese sniper effectiveness varied by unit, but the pattern was consistent. Where precision was met with precision, the duel ended quickly. By mid-1943, quiet adjustments were underway across the Pacific. Units began informally identifying their best shots. Scoped rifles, once rare and frowned upon, appeared more frequently. Not as official sniper systems, but as tools assigned to men who demonstrated restraint. The Army did not change its doctrine overnight. It never does. But it began to bend. John George did not set out to challenge the institution. He simply refused to surrender skills he knew worked. Guadalcanal gave him the environment to prove their value, not through argument, but through outcome. The jungle did not care what rifle was standard issue. It did not care what the manual said. It rewarded the man who could see first, decide correctly, and fire once. And in that environment, the Army began to relearn something it had once known well. That wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by men who know exactly when to use them. To understand why John George's method worked, American officers first had to understand the men he was fighting. Japanese snipers were not simply infantrymen with rifles. They were selected, trained, and conditioned for a very specific kind of war. One that valued invisibility over aggression and patience over speed. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine did not treat the sniper as a supporting asset. It treated him as a psychological weapon. His purpose was not merely to kill, but to unsettle, to slow movement, to force hesitation. A single well-placed shot could halt an advance more effectively than a machine gun because it introduced doubt. And doubt, once planted, spread quickly. Japanese sniper training emphasized concealment above all else. Men learned to become part of the terrain. They used spider holes, tree platforms, and natural depressions that broke up the human outline. Camouflage was not decorative, it was structural. Vegetation was woven into uniforms. Skin was darkened. Rifles were wrapped to eliminate shine. Even breathing was controlled to avoid movement. They did not hunt targets the way American soldiers expected. They observed patterns. Who walked point? Who paused to give hand signals? Who lingered near radios or map cases? Officers and non-commissioned officers were favored targets. Not because of rank alone, but because removing leadership created confusion disproportionate to the effort required. Japanese snipers were taught to fire only when success was nearly certain. Ammunition conservation was not merely logistical, it was psychological. Every missed shot risked detection. Every unnecessary shot weakened the illusion of omnipresence that made snipers so effective. This doctrine had been refined in China long before American forces arrived in the Pacific. By the time Guadalcanal began, Japanese snipers were experienced in fighting enemies who relied on mass and momentum. They knew how to bleed an advancing force slowly without revealing themselves. American infantrymen found this deeply unsettling. They were accustomed to locating the enemy through return fire. The Japanese sniper denied them that option. He fired once and disappeared. There was no exchange, no visible opponent. It's just a body on the ground and the growing sense that the jungle itself was hostile. Standard American countermeasures were blunt. Suppressive fire into likely positions. Rapid movement to deny the sniper time. These techniques worked against machine guns and fixed defenses. Against a patient marksman, they often failed. John George approached the problem differently because he understood the mindset behind it. He did not look for targets. He looked for habits. Japanese snipers, disciplined as they were, still operated within constraints. They favored certain types of terrain. They reused successful positions. They watched the same approaches repeatedly. Over time, they became confident. That confidence, not recklessness, created openings. George used time as his primary tool. He did not rush to engage after a shot was fired. He assumed the sniper would remain still, trusting his concealment. George waited longer than doctrine recommended, sometimes much longer. He allowed the sniper's patience to work against him. Through his scope, George studied not the sniper himself, but the environment around him. Leaves that moved differently. Shadows that did not align with the sun. Straight lines where none should exist. The human eye is drawn to patterns, and humans, even well-trained ones, inevitably impose order on chaos. When George fired, he did so without warning and without repetition. One shot, then silence. He did not scan immediately for a second target. He did not fire again unless absolutely necessary. He understood that revealing his own position would invite a duel he did not need to fight. This approach mirrored Japanese doctrine more closely than American. In effect, George was fighting the sniper on his own terms, using discipline rather than aggression. The result was not just tactical success, but psychological dominance. Japanese snipers began to hesitate. They delayed shots. They relocated more frequently. They avoided firing at all in sectors where American counter-snipers were suspected. That hesitation reduced their effectiveness dramatically. A sniper who does not fire is merely a concealed observer. American units noticed the change before they understood it. Patrols moved farther without contact. Casualties dropped. The constant pressure lifted. Men began to trust the quiet again, a trust that had been absent since the first sniper round cracked overhead. This shift mattered because jungle warfare was as much mental as physical. Fear slowed movement. Hesitation broke coordination. When that fear receded, units regained initiative. They moved deliberately rather than reactively. What made George's success especially significant was that it did not rely on special equipment or formal authority. He was not operating as part of a designated sniper team. He did not have official sanction. He had only his rifle, his position, and his judgment. That made his example dangerous to rigid doctrine. Institutions prefer solutions that can be issued, trained, and inspected. George's method required trust in the individual. It required accepting that not every decision could be prescribed in advance. That ran against decades of organizational thinking. Yet battlefield reality continued to support his approach. As the campaign progressed, similar stories emerged elsewhere in the Pacific. On New Georgia, on Bougainville, on New Britain. Individual riflemen, often using non-standard weapons or optics, began to dominate sniper duels, not through speed, but through restraint. These men were not celebrated at the time. There were no medals specifically for patience. Our contributions appeared in casualty statistics and in the quiet sectors of the line. They were known locally, within companies and battalions, but rarely beyond. The Japanese noticed them all the same. Captured documents later revealed growing concern about American counter-sniper effectiveness. Instructions emphasized increased movement, shorter firing windows, and greater reliance on supporting fires. The sniper, once an independent psychological weapon, was gradually pulled back into a supporting role. That shift marked a subtle victory. John George did not live to see the broader implications of what he had demonstrated. At the time, he was simply doing what worked. But his experience exposed a flaw in American thinking that extended beyond Guadalcanal. The Army had assumed that modern war rendered the individual marksman obsolete. The Pacific proved the opposite. In environments where technology was constrained by terrain, human skill reasserted itself. The sniper duel was not a contest of rifles. It was a contest of minds. And in that contest, the man who could wait longest, observe most carefully, and fire only when certain held the advantage. Guadalcanal forced the Army to confront that reality, not through theory, but through loss. And through the quiet effectiveness of one lieutenant who refused to believe that speed alone decided who survived. The lesson lingered, even if it was not yet fully understood. and it would surface again in later campaigns, when the jungle demanded the same discipline and the same patience from a new generation of American soldiers. By the time Guadalcanal was declared secure, the United States Army had learned many lessons it would never formally acknowledge. Official histories would emphasize logistics, naval support, and air superiority. They would speak of attrition and momentum. What they would not dwell on were the small, quiet adjustments that saved lives without ever appearing on a map. John George's rifle never appeared in a field manual. No doctrine was rewritten to recommend civilian sporting rifles. No training circular instructed young officers to trust patience over volume. Institutions change slowly and only when forced. What changed instead was behavior, quietly, informally, permanently. Battalion commanders began asking different questions. Not how many rifles a unit had, but who could actually shoot. Platoon leaders started assigning overwatch based on demonstrated judgment rather than rank alone. Men who had once been told to fire faster were now told to wait. These changes did not make headlines. They did not need to. They showed up in casualty reports that were shorter than expected, in patrols that returned intact, in sectors that stayed quiet. The Pacific Theater demanded humility. It punished assumptions imported from other wars, stripped technology of its guarantees, and forced soldiers back onto fundamentals that armies had relied on for centuries before mechanization promised easier answers. Guadalcanal reminded the Army that a rifle is not powerful because it fires quickly. It is powerful because it allows a thinking human being to impose order on chaos. That truth was uncomfortable. Modern armies prefer certainty. They prefer systems that minimize dependence on individual judgment. Semi-automatic rifles, standardized training, and doctrinal solutions all exist to reduce variability. But the jungle reintroduced variability whether planners liked it or not. It rewarded the man who could slow down. John George was not a rebel. He was not defiant. He did not seek to embarrass his superiors or challenge the institution. He simply refused to discard skills that had taken him years to master. When placed in an environment that valued those skills, the results spoke for themselves. The Winchester Model 70 was never the point. Any accurate rifle in disciplined hands could have produced similar results. What mattered was the philosophy behind its use. One shot, one decision, one outcome. That philosophy would resurface decades later when the Army formally embraced snipers as a specialized discipline. When marksmanship once again became a point of pride rather than an afterthought. When optics, once dismissed as unnecessary, became standard. By then, few would remember Guadalcanal's quiet lessons. Fewer still would remember John George by name, but the influence remained. Every time a sniper is told to wait rather than rush. Every time a commander accepts that restraint can be more lethal than aggression. Every time a soldier understands that the first shot is the one that matters most, the legacy endures. Wars are often explained through machines and movements, through factories and fleets. But they are decided, in the end, by individuals placed in moments where judgment matters more than doctrine. On Guadalcanal, amid heat, rot, and fear, one lieutenant proved that modern war had not erased the value of precision. It had merely obscured it. The jungle revealed it again, quietly, decisively, and forever.